I took my dream job until my boss told me never to open one locked drawer in his offices. The best job offer of my life came with one strange condition. My new boss looked me straight in the eyes and said, "There's only one rule in this office. Never open the bottom drawer of my desk." At first, I laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. 3 months later, I wished I'd listened. I just accepted a position as an executive assistant for a successful architecture firm in Chicago. The salary was almost double what I was making before. The office was beautiful, and everyone seemed genuinely friendly. It felt like the fresh start I'd been waiting for. My boss, Richard, had built the company from nothing. He was respected by every employee, generous with his staff, and surprisingly approachable. Nothing about him seemed unusual, except that one locked drawer in the corner of his desk. On my first day, while showing me around his office, Richard casually placed his hand on the desk. "If you ever need anything, it's yours." Then he pointed toward the bottom drawer. "Everything, except that." He smiled, but his eyes didn't. The drawer was always locked, every morning, every afternoon, every evening. It wasn't a modern lock either. It used a small brass key that Richard carried on the same keychain as his car keys. He never left it behind. At first, I didn't think much about it. Every boss has personnel belongings they'd rather keep private. Maybe it contained legal documents, family photos, or confidential contracts. It wasn't my place to ask questions, or so I kept telling myself. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. Whenever Richard had to leave the office unexpectedly, he'd check the drawer before walking out. Not his laptop, not his phone. The drawer, every single time. One afternoon, the cleaning supervisor stopped by my desk while Richard was out meeting a client. She looked toward his office before quietly asking, "He still keeps it locked?" I nodded. She didn't say another word. She just walked away. That tiny conversation stayed with me for days. It wasn't what she'd asked. It was how she'd asked it. Like someone who already knew the answer and wished she didn't. The following Monday, Richard rushed out of the office after receiving an emergency phone call. For the first time since I'd started working there, he forgot his keys on the desk, including the small brass key. I stared at the keys for several seconds. It would have taken less than 5 seconds to unlock the drawer, satisfy my curiosity, and lock it again before Richard returned. My hand even reached toward the brass key once, but I pulled it back. Something about that warning no longer felt like a joke. Richard came back 20 minutes later looking exhausted. Before taking off his coat, he walked straight to his desk. His eyes immediately landed on the keys. He picked them up, glanced at the drawer for a brief moment, and only then relaxed. It was as if he'd been worried about one thing and one thing only. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Every visitor who entered Richard's office was politely asked to sit on the opposite side of the room, away from the desk. Even during meetings, he subtly positioned himself between everyone else and that locked drawer. One evening, while organizing old project files, I noticed a faded photograph tucked inside a folder. Richard looked much younger, standing beside another man I had never seen before. Someone had written a date on the back, and underneath it, only 2 words, "Last Partnership." The next morning, I asked one of the senior architects if he knew the man in the photo. The smile disappeared from his face almost instantly. "Where did you find that?" he asked. When I pointed toward the archive room, he quietly replied, "You should put it back and forget you ever saw it." That answer only made me more curious. Later that afternoon, I searched the company's website, old press releases, and even local business records. Every article praised Richard as the founder of the firm. None of them mentioned another partner. It was as if the man in the photograph had never existed. A week later, Richard left for a 3-day conference in New York. Before leaving, he called me into his office. "You'll have access to everything while I'm gone," he said, placing several folders on the desk. Then he paused, looked directly at the locked drawer, and added, "Everything except that." After he left, the office felt unusually quiet. Late that evening, while everyone else had gone home, I was finishing a report when I heard someone gently knock on the glass door of Richard's office. Standing outside was the cleaning supervisor, holding a small envelope in her hand. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and placed the envelope on the desk without saying a word. Written across the front, in neat handwriting, were just 4 words: "For the next assistant." Before I could ask anything, she quietly walked away. My name wasn't on the envelope. There was no stamp, no address, and no signature. I looked toward the locked drawer, then back at the envelope. For the first time since starting that job, I had the feeling that someone wanted me to discover the truth before Richard came back. I picked up the envelope and hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. There were no greetings, no signature, just one sentence typed across the center. "If you're reading this, Richard still hasn't told you what happened to Daniel." I read the sentence 3 times. Daniel. It had to be the man from the old photograph. Before I could think any further, I noticed something else inside the envelope, a small brass key, almost identical to the one Richard carried every day, except this one was slightly older and badly scratched. My pulse quickened as I compared the key to the lock on the bottom drawer. It looked almost identical. Whoever had left the envelope knew exactly what they were doing. The question wasn't whether the key would fit. The real question was why someone wanted me to use it. I slipped the key into my pocket without trying it. If someone was testing me, I wasn't going to make their job easy. Just then, my phone vibrated. It was the cleaning supervisor. Her message contained only 6 words: "Don't do it while you're alone." That message changed everything. Until then, I'd assumed she wanted me to open the drawer. Now it sounded more like a warning than an invitation. Whatever was inside wasn't dangerous because of what it was, but because of what it would mean once I saw it. The following morning, I arrived earlier than usual. Richard was still in New York, and the office was completely empty. I unlocked the front door, walked through the silent hallway, and stopped outside his office. The brass key felt heavier in my pocket than it should have. I closed the office door behind me and stood in front of the desk. My hand slowly reached for the lock. Just as the key touched the metal, I heard footsteps outside. Someone had entered the office much earlier than expected. The footsteps stopped right outside Richard's office. I quickly pulled the key away and slipped it back into my pocket. A second later, there was a gentle knock on the door. It wasn't Richard. It was the senior architect who had warned me about the old photograph. He stepped inside, closed the door, and looked directly at the drawer before looking at me. "She gave you the envelope, didn't she?" he asked. I didn't answer. He sighed quietly. "Then we're already too late." Before I could ask what he meant, he walked over to the window and lowered his voice. "Richard thinks he's protecting everyone by keeping that drawer locked." He paused for a moment. "The truth is, he's protecting himself." I asked him who Daniel was. Instead of answering, he pulled out a chair and sat down. "Before this company had 50 employees, it only had 2, he said. "Richard and Daniel." He looked at the photograph on Richard's desk. "Everything you're seeing today was built by both of them." "Then why does everyone call Richard the founder?" I asked. The architect let out a quiet laugh. "Because that's the version people were told." He paused before adding, "After Daniel disappeared, Richard never corrected anyone. Eventually, everyone stopped asking." The word "disappeared" stayed with me. "You mean he died?" I asked. He slowly shook his head. "No one knows. According to him, Daniel walked out of the office one Friday evening almost 15 years earlier and was never seen at work again. There was no farewell, no resignation, nothing." "What does that have to do with the drawer?" I asked. He looked directly at the lock before answering. "Richard believes that if nobody opens it, the past stays buried." I frowned. "Believes?"
He nodded. He's never had the strength to empty it.
Just then, the architect stood up and reached into his jacket. He handed me an old business card with faded lettering. It belonged to Daniel. On the back, someone had handwritten an address just outside Chicago. "If you really want answers," he said, "don't start with the drawer. Start there." That evening, I drove to the address expecting an abandoned office or an empty lot. Instead, I found a small house at the end of a quiet street. The mailbox still displayed the surname Carter. My heart started racing as I walked toward the front door. Before I could knock, an elderly woman opened the door as if she'd been expecting someone. The moment I mentioned Daniel's name, her eyes filled with emotion. She looked at me for a long second before quietly asking, "Does Richard finally want to tell the truth?" I admitted I didn't know the whole story. She invited me inside and placed a worn cardboard box on the table. It was filled with photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings. Resting on top was a framed picture of Richard and Daniel shaking hands on the day they opened the company. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone from that office to knock on this door," she said softly. Richard never came back. Then she slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name wasn't on it. Neither was hers. It was addressed to Richard, and it had never been opened. She pushed the envelope toward me. "He deserves to read it," she whispered, "but I don't think he'll ever have the courage." As I stared at Richard's name written across the front, I realized the locked drawer might not be hiding a secret. It might be hiding a regret. I asked her why she had never mailed the letter. She looked down at the envelope before answering. "Because Richard promised he'd come back for it himself." She smiled sadly. "For the first few years, I believed him. After that, I realized he was avoiding something much bigger than me." She explained that Daniel wasn't just Richard's business partner. They had been best friends since college. Together, they had spent years working late nights, borrowing money, and risking everything to build the company. Neither of them could have done it alone, she said. "So what happened?" I finally asked. She took a slow breath before answering. "They received the biggest contract of their lives. For a moment, everything they dreamed about was finally within reach. Then, only days before signing it, Daniel made a decision Richard never understood. Instead of accepting the contract, Daniel wanted to walk away from the business. His wife had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and he told Richard there were things more important than becoming successful. Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. They argued for hours inside that very office. According to Daniel's wife, it was the first time she'd ever seen them raise their voices at each other. Neither man expected it to become the last conversation they would ever have. The next morning, Daniel packed a small bag, left the office early, and drove straight to the hospital. He never returned to work. Over the following months, his wife's condition worsened, and every ounce of his energy went into taking care of her. Richard tried calling several times during those first weeks, but pride quickly replaced concern. He convinced himself that Daniel had abandoned both him and the company. Instead of reaching out again, he buried himself in work and never knocked on that family's door. By the time Richard finally learned how serious the situation had been, almost 2 years had passed. Daniel's wife had already passed away, and Daniel himself had moved away without telling anyone where he was going. The friendship ended without either of them ever saying goodbye. I looked back at the unopened envelope on the table. "Did Daniel write this before he left?" I asked. She slowly nodded. He asked Richard to read it only when he was ready to forgive him and himself. As I held the envelope in my hands, I realized the locked drawer suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't protecting a company secret. It was protecting a man from the one conversation he'd spent 15 years trying to avoid. I drove back to Chicago with the unopened letter resting on the passenger seat. More than once, I thought about reading it myself, but every time my hand reached for the envelope, I stopped.
Whatever Daniel wanted to say had never been meant for me.
Richard returned from New York the following morning. He greeted everyone as usual, thanked me for handling the office, and walked into his office without noticing anything unusual. Watching him smile, it was hard to believe he'd been carrying the same weight for 15 years.
The envelope stayed inside my backpack all day. Several times I considered giving it to him, but something held me back. I wanted to understand one thing first. Why keep a locked drawer for 15 years if the real answer had always been waiting inside a letter he'd never collected?
Late that afternoon, I finally asked Richard a simple question. "Do you ever think about Daniel?" The smile disappeared from his face so quickly it caught me off guard. He looked toward the window before quietly answering, "Every single day." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Richard surprised me by asking, "Did someone mention his name to you?" I could have lied. Instead, I slowly nodded. He closed his eyes for a second, almost as if he'd known this moment would eventually come. "I've spent years pretending that drawer was the hardest thing to open," Richard admitted. "The truth is, I was never afraid of what was inside it." He paused before finishing the sentence. "I was afraid it would remind me of the man I used to be." Without another word, I reached into my backpack and placed the unopened envelope on his desk. Richard stared at his own name written across the front. His hands froze. For several seconds he didn't even try to touch it. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. I told him about the visit, Daniel's wife, and everything she'd shared with me. Richard didn't interrupt once. By the time I finished, his eyes were fixed on the envelope, but they were no longer seeing the paper. They were looking 15 years into the past. He finally picked it up, turned it over, and ran his thumb across the sealed edge. Then, to my surprise, he placed it back on the desk without opening it. "Not yet," he said quietly. "There's something you need to see first." Richard stood up, reached into his pocket, and slowly placed the small brass key beside the envelope. Then he looked at me and spoke the words I'd been waiting to hear since my first day. "Let's open the drawer together." Richard unlocked the drawer with trembling hands. For a moment, neither of us moved. I'd imagined confidential files, stacks of cash, or some hidden company secret. Instead, the drawer contained only a few ordinary objects that had been sitting there untouched for 15 years. On top was an old leather notebook, a cracked coffee mug with the company logo, and a framed photograph of Richard and Daniel laughing in an empty office surrounded by unfinished blueprints. Beneath them rested a folded sheet of paper with one sentence written across the front: "Don't forget why we started." Richard carefully picked up the photograph before speaking. "We bought that mug with the last $20 we had," he said with a faint smile. "Back then, we thought success meant building the biggest company in the city." His smile slowly disappeared. He opened the notebook and handed it to me. It wasn't a diary. Every page was filled with ideas, sketches, goals, and handwritten promises they had made to each other during the company's first years. At the bottom of the very first page, both of them had signed their names. One promise caught my attention immediately. If one of us ever loses sight of what matters, the other has to remind him. Richard stared at those words for a long time before quietly saying, "Daniel kept his promise. I didn't." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The drawer hadn't been locked because it contained something valuable. It had been locked because every object inside reminded Richard of the friend he'd convinced himself to forget, even though he'd never truly stopped missing him. Finally, Richard reached for the unopened envelope. This time, his hands didn't hesitate. He slowly broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As his eyes moved across the page, I watched every expression on his face change without him saying a single word. Halfway through the letter, Richard stopped reading. He covered his mouth with one hand and quietly sat down. I'd never seen him look vulnerable before. Whatever Daniel had written wasn't an accusation. Somehow, That made it even harder to read. After a long silence, Richard handed me the letter. "You should know why I could never throw any of this away," he said. I looked at the first line and immediately understood why he'd spent 15 years avoiding those words. The letter didn't begin with anger. It didn't begin with disappointment either. It began with 6 simple words that change everything. "Richard, none of this is your fault." I kept reading while Richard stared out the window. Daniel wrote that he never blamed him for their argument. He understood why Richard had fought so hard for the company. They simply wanted different things at that moment in their lives, and neither of them had known how to say goodbye. Further down the page, Daniel admitted something Richard had never known. He'd planned to come back after his wife recovered. He never intended to leave the company forever. But life had unfolded differently, and with every passing month, returning became harder than staying away. The final paragraph wasn't about business at all. It was about friendship. Daniel wrote that no building, contract, or amount of money could ever mean more to him than the years they'd spent chasing a dream together. He hoped Richard would remember that someday. When I finished reading, the office was completely silent. Richard finally spoke. "I spent 15 years believing he hated me." He gave a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "And all this time, he was hoping I'd forgive myself." Richard carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he picked up the old notebook again. Between 2 pages, a small business card slipped onto the desk. Written on the back was a phone number and an address I hadn't seen before. Richard stared at the handwriting for several seconds before smiling through tears. "That's his writing," he whispered. "He must have left it there the day he wrote the letter." For the first time since I'd met him, I saw hope replace regret. Without saying another word, Richard reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over the numbers for almost a minute before he finally pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then someone answered. Richard didn't speak immediately. His eyes filled with tears as he listened to the voice on the other end. Finally, he smiled and quietly said, "Hi, Daniel. It's been a long time." Then he walked out of the office, giving both of them the privacy they'd waited 15 years to have. I never heard the rest of that conversation. I didn't need to. Some moments don't belong to the people who witness them. They belong to the people who spent years waiting for them to happen. As I looked back at the open drawer, I realized it had never been hiding a secret. It had been holding on to a friendship that neither man had truly been ready to let go of. Richard came back nearly an hour later. His eyes were still red, but the weight he'd carried for years seemed lighter somehow. He sat across from me and smiled. "He's alive," he said, and somehow he was happy to hear my voice. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes around the office. Richard laughed more, stayed late less often, and for the first time since I'd started working there, he left the bottom drawer unlocked. No one else noticed, but I did. The following Friday, Richard asked me to clear his afternoon schedule. "I've got an important meeting," he said. There was no client, no architect, and no investor on his calendar. Just one name, Daniel. When Richard returned that evening, he looked happier than I'd ever seen him. He didn't tell me everything they talked about, but he did share one sentence that stayed with me. "We wasted 15 years arguing with memories instead of talking to each other." A month later, the company held its annual meeting. Every employee expected the usual presentation about new projects and future plans. Instead, Richard walked onto the stage holding an old photograph in one hand and a leather notebook in the other. "I've spent years accepting credit that never belonged to me alone," he began. The room fell silent. Then, in front of every employee, every client, and every partner, Richard told the real story of how the company had started. For the first time in 15 years, Daniel's name appeared on the screen behind him. Richard spoke about the friendship, the mistakes they had both made,
and the price of letting pride replace a single honest conversation. No one in the room moved.
When the presentation ended, everyone stood and applauded. It wasn't because the company had grown. It was because they just watched a man admit his biggest mistake without making excuses for it. That took far more courage than any business success. As people began leaving the room, Richard walked over to me with the old brass key in his hand. He smiled before placing it on the table. "I don't think I'll be needing this anymore," he said. I picked up the key and looked toward the office where everything had started. The drawer was still there, but it no longer felt like a place where secrets were hidden. It had become a reminder that some doors stay locked only because we're afraid of what we'll feel when we finally open them. About 6 months later, I was organizing some old files when Richard walked into my office holding a small package. "I think this belongs to you," he said. Inside was the old brass key, now attached to a brand new keychain with a small engraved compass. I looked at him, confused. Richard smiled. "You were the only person who cared enough to ask questions instead of making assumptions." He paused for a moment. "That key doesn't open a drawer anymore. It reminds me never to lock away the people who matter." Before leaving, Richard handed me another envelope. This one had my name written across the front. I laughed nervously. "Should I wait 15 years before opening it?" He smiled. "No. Open that one whenever life convinces you it's easier to stay silent than to have an honest conversation." Inside was a handwritten note. "The biggest mistakes in life are rarely the ones we make. They're the conversations we keep postponing." I folded the paper and quietly slipped it into my wallet, where it still is today. A few weeks later, Daniel visited the office for the first time in over 15 years. There were no speeches, no cameras, and no celebration. Just two old friends sitting in the conference room with coffee, laughing about stories that nobody else in the building had ever heard. Watching them together, it was impossible to imagine they'd spent so many years apart. Time had changed their faces, their lives, and their priorities. But somehow, it hadn't erased the friendship that had started everything. As I walked past Richard's office that evening, I noticed the bottom drawer was slightly open. Inside were the same photograph, the old notebook, and the coffee mug. Nothing had been thrown away anymore. Nothing needed to be hidden. I realized then that the drawer had never been the heart of the story. It was simply the place where one man had hidden his guilt until he found the courage to replace it with forgiveness. Sometimes the hardest doors to open aren't locked with keys. They're locked by pride, regret, and the fear of hearing words we should have said years ago. Richard finally opened his, and it gave him his best friend back. I took my dream job expecting to build a career. Instead, I witnessed something far more valuable, the day two people stopped letting the past decide the rest of their lives. And somehow, that became the greatest lesson I brought home from that office. Years have passed since that first day when Richard warned me never to open the locked drawer. Looking back, I sometimes laugh at how convinced I was that it was hiding some dark secret. I couldn't have been more wrong. The real secret wasn't inside the drawer. It was inside a man who had spent 15 years punishing himself for a goodbye that had never happened. The lock had never been there to keep other people out. It had been there to keep painful memories in. I still work at the company today. Every new employee eventually notices the old photograph hanging on the wall outside Richard's office. Two young men standing in an unfinished room, smiling like they believed anything was possible. Most people walk past it without asking who the second man is. But every now and then, someone stops long enough to be curious. When that happens, Richard never changes the subject anymore. Instead, he proudly tells them Daniel's story from the very beginning. A few months ago, Daniel visited the office again. Before leaving, he walked over to the old desk, gently closed the bottom drawer, smiled at Richard, and quietly said, "I think it's finally empty." Richard smiled back. "No," he replied, "it's finally at peace." As I watched them leave together that afternoon, I realized something I'll probably never forget. Some of the strongest friendships don't end because people stop caring. They end because both sides spend too much time waiting for the other one to speak first. I accepted that job, hoping it would change my career. I never imagined it would change the way I looked at regret, forgiveness, and second chances. And every time I see that old brass key hanging on my desk, I'm reminded that some doors are worth opening, no matter how long they've been closed.